They say a man's house is his castle. Well, I only wish my house was a castle. I've wondered how I'd defend my house from some undefined incursion on several occasions, as one does. Rainbow Six Siege lets you take a crack at defending some buildings. In fact, they make you do it, as it's part of the base gameplay loop. You may as well learn how to do it properly, right? I'm Minotaur, and this is Defense 101 in Rainbow Six Siege. Now, before we get to all the fun stuff like means of site setup, there's a couple things I'd like to explain quickly. The first thing is the difference in mindset between setting up a defense and preparing an attack. Attack has to solve problems and therefore requires a more versatile range of operators, whereas defense wants to create problems for the attackers and has less to worry about covering everything, as that's what attack does. This is all a very long-winded way of saying that you shouldn't get too stressed out trying to fill whatever operator your team needs as you should on attack, but rather to find out how to make attacking harder. A hard breacher is almost always needed while on attack, but while on defense, you don't always need wall denial. As you learn sites and maps, ask yourself if the team needs to stop instead of trying to auto-select a type like you would on attack. Defense still has types though, and we'll get to that soon. The other part of the important house cleaning to get out of the way is that site is your oyster. Don't like this wall? Take it down. Want to sit up here? Make yourself at home. With defense, you get to set up site however you like. Before you do though, tell your randoms what's going on, as that's common courtesy. Just because they can be annoying from time to time doesn't mean you have to be as well. I will point out that it's still worth learning default site setups and why things tend to be molded in certain ways. You can use that knowledge to make your custom site setups harder to take. While explaining every site in the game is a bit out of the reach of this video, the tools and techniques are and will be explained. I do have a couple of site setup vids if you're interested, link in the description. Instead of explaining ops you'd want to take, we're going to do that after, as the ops should be selected to take advantage of your setup as a whole instead of taking all the tools you'd want as you would with attackers. Let's explain some site setup first. Rotates are holes that allow you to travel to places quicker, at least on the surface. A reoccurring idea that you'll probably notice is that a lot of our techniques are designed to maintain control over a wider area of the map, and rotates are no different. Common spots are usually between sites. To best explain, let's take a look at an example. Bottom floor Oregon, there's a rotate placed between the two sites. Defenders will have multiple routes that they can take to get to laundry if this spot is open. Foot traffic will have multiple angles of patrolling site. If it's closed, defenders will only have one avenue to move from. If a plant goes down in laundry, the attack will have a much easier time holding the diffuser, as they have less angles to look out for. Another use for a rotate is also in Oregon, but this time top floor. A rotate from kids to attic is paramount to a proper hold on top floor, but why? For starters, games is one of the most ideal spots to plant. If defenders have no way of getting into attic, they have to funnel through this common area, opening them up to covering fire from trophy. With a rotate in place, attic is accessible and the game's breach can be held, and in extension, games. While we're in the attic, let's take a look at head holes. Head holes allow us to contest a larger part of the map while remaining impassable for attackers. Should our defender fall in battle, attackers are not able to get through unless they sacrifice some utility, but we'll expand on that later. This is a point that separates a rotate from head holes. Head holes are important for holding areas outside sight. These head holes in attic allow the defender to hold both armory hall and master bedroom. These aren't very complicated. There's less to them than a rotate, as newer players tend to like reinforcing everything and they need to learn that this isn't an effective strategy, but a head hole is just a straight line. Footholes are the bizarre cousin of the head holes. They're intended as a one-way angle, as you can see the enemy feet, but they can't see you. The way this works is hard to explain, so I'll leave you with an expertly crafted diagram that did not take 5 minutes. Villa is a good example of footholes, as footholes are important to holding games room. The outer walls here tend to be reinforced just so they can't be opened and give angles that may screw up our defense, but the inner walls will open up the bottom of the wall. Any attacker will have to pass these holes till they get to the door, giving any defender a free pick if the attacker is not careful. They can always open the wall, but that burns utility and that wall doesn't give as good of angles as the outer ones do. Kill holes are a bit of a blanket term, just meaning the various holes that we shoot through. This is important to bring up after the more specific kill holes like head and foot holes, because there are some other types that are more loosely defined. For example, some holes are elevated higher than normal head holes. These holes allow our defender on top of something like a desk to use them as regular head holes, but Any angles into sight are cancelled by the fact that the only thing that an attacker can see is the ceiling, allowing for the sight to remain somewhat safe, while standard head holes allow angles into sight. Another example is opening up floors. No one looks up a lot of the time, even when droning. Holes in the ceiling can give defenders the advantage they need to win a free gunfight, as it's unexpected. Biggest risk is you have to have a heavy roam to pull it off, and it requires map knowledge. These holes can also be placed under a window, for example, waiting for someone to vault in. Please note that this is very risky, as checking for frost mats is a good habit to develop, and people will pre-fire your angle just in case of a mat. If you die to this, you didn't learn it from me. That's where very basic knowledge ends, but we also have one last setup type that's a bit more nuanced, the vault rotate. It's a bit like a rotate, but to get through, you're locked in a vault animation. Vault rotates are for places we still want access to freely, but are liable to being taken by the enemy. It sounds weird, but let me explain a little further and then provide an example. When your character vaults through something, the game moves your crosshair, making it harder to aim. Your character also makes a sound cue when going through the rotate. These two things combined make it more of a risk to pass through than just walking through something. Now let's take a look at the example. On Clubhouse, when defending Master and Gym, it helps to be able to traverse through the bathroom in order to get an alternative route to Gym instead of going all the way through the hallway and exposing yourself to main stairs and Logi. If your bandit fails to trick the wall, you can get away much easier as well. So why not a regular rotate? Why vault? Well, the breach is right there. On the event that the breach gets open and the attackers try to get in, a regular rotate being right there allows them easy access to our entire site. If we make it a vault rotate, the enemy will have to commit, throwing off their aim in the push and making a sound cue to know exactly what's coming and to react appropriately. Now that we know how to set up site, how do we select a site? Unless you're playing casual, you may choose whichever site you like. Most competitive maps have 3 floors, so we'll go over that first. Top floor sites are commonly picked first, with basement sites picked second and first floor sites picked last. The reason for this is that when defending top floor, no one will ever be above you except for the occasional hatch that you won't find on most maps. People will either push straight to you or have to fight up a staircase. Basement sites will never have someone below you, but floors above you can be open to grant attackers sight lines. This usually isn't great, but it's better than 1F sites. On 1F sites, you have the same problem as the basement site where your ceiling can be opened up, but you also have to deal with the people coming from below you instead of people coming from your level and one other level. They will come from all levels of the map. You can think of 2-floor maps like Coastline or Theme Park as a 3-floor map, but without the middle floor. It sounds obvious, but all sites are either 2F or the basement equivalent. When you look at it like that, it becomes a bit easier to pick a site. Before we move on, I'd like to point out that all this isn't a law or anything. If you don't like a certain site, you don't have to go there just because it's a 2nd floor site. For example, I don't like the basement on Lair. It's too maze-like for me. I prefer going 1F sites there. Of course there will be that one guy upset that you went somewhere, but it's better to be comfortable on a slightly worse site than be uncomfortable on a slightly better site. Just make sure that you call what you're up to, so people can adjust their ops accordingly. Now that we've covered site setup, we should take a look at playstyles and then some operator types the team will need. The 2 main playstyles are roaming and anchoring. Anchoring is much simpler to understand, so we'll cover that first. It's more or less a fancy way of saying that you'll stay in or near site. It's probably the easiest thing for a newcomer to master. You just wait with the bomb, and when a bad guy comes in, you shoot him. Now obviously there's a bit more to it than that. That's just what's expected for the player that installed yesterday. The next step in the anchor's evolution is to take a look at areas outside site to prevent them from getting in. Instead of sitting in a corner, you peek a door or head holes to hold the rooms next to site as well. Think of it this way. If the enemy only has to worry about getting in sight, they have almost 3 minutes to try and find a solution. If they have to worry about getting into the room next to site and then site, they have more problems to solve in the same amount of time, which is much more difficult for them. That particular point ties into roamers quite heavily, but I want to go over the final stage we want our anchors to be able to achieve, which is more map control around site and the shallow roam. By this, I mean we want our anchor to be able to move a room or 2 out of sight as the need requires. Sight is still your responsibility, but buying time just outside is quite often needed. The image is still a bit blurry, I'm sure, so let's look at an example. Top floor bank. A new anchor will wait in CEO for people to break in. A more experienced anchor will set up a head hole into top square. Our anchors still control sight, but they also control an important piece of real estate. An anchor who's comfortable with a shallow roam, however, might position themselves just outside janitor. We have an angle on top square, just like our second stage of anchor. Some footholds in stock allow us to contest it, and we can see down the hall past white stairs to the elevators. But Minotaur, we aren't guarding sight anymore, right? Well, we go back into janitor and through a rotate we prepared, and we're back to holding sight. It takes like 3 seconds. If something bad happens, like your bro by secondary gets taken out, the response is quick, and you're back to holding sight as a regular anchor. Now, let's take a look at roamers. Really quick, I'd like to point out that roaming is very popular. You're more often getting into fights and racking up kills, so it's rather flashy, which means it's more sought after. There are a lot of roamers. A good roamer, however, a bit more rare and worth much more to the team. Entry-level roamers do exactly what they say on the tin. They roam. You go off and sightsee, and if you hear gunshots, you go check it out. That is unfortunately where a lot of roamers get stuck. Sure, they get 2 kills, but being 2 floors away from sight when there's 10 seconds left, your usefulness clearly ran out. Roaming is a lot more loose, and a lot of it is just game sense, but the tips I can give you are almost all about time. The anchor's spreading out sight control over a wider area is your job, but on a smaller scale. You start off the match with trying to stop people from getting inside the building in general. You are the first line of defense. So let's say that you get into a gunfight. You get a kill, or maybe you don't. Regardless of what happens in the first second of that gunfight, you have to ask yourself a question. Am I still comfortable being in this gunfight? If not, leave. There's 2 reasons. First reason is that there's a lot less at stake if you leave. You are not sight. If you lose this random bend in the hallway, it's not the end of the world. Stay alive, go somewhere else, and pick a fight that you are comfortable with. You're better alive than dead. The second reason is fear. Say you miss, your enemy will be waiting for you to peek again. But you don't. You could have gone anywhere in 5 seconds. You could still just be around the corner, but you could also be 3 or 4 rooms away by now. The attackers will be faced with a choice. Continue on as normal, or track you down. If they continue on towards sight, you have their rear and can smash them against sight or pick off any stragglers from the group. If they track you down, they're focusing on you instead of sight. If you can stall them an extra 40 seconds, that's 40 seconds less they get to spend breaking into sight, which matters much more. Yeah, getting kills is great, but they'll only get you so far. It's the combination of those fancy plays and just general strategy that'll win you matches. Again, time is important for roaming and other aspects, that being where you position. In a 2F site, being in the basement for the first 30 seconds is fine. This is called a deep roam, being very far from sight. People tend to not drone if they're far from sight, making picks down here quite easy for a short while. After a while though, attackers will only be found closer to sight. After a minute into the match, you should no longer be here. The argument that you're waiting for a flank falls apart once the enemy actually gets into sight. You can't stay down there forever. As the timer ticks down, you should be gradually getting closer and closer to sight. Once that timer hits about 20, the attackers have no time for anything besides desperation plays. It's all hands on deck. You need to be there at that time or strike and get your flank off in that time. In a healthy and unstressed environment, your roamers should help the anchors with a shallow roam around the 1 minute to 40 second mark. A roamer that plays all their cards right and pays attention to the time is worth a whole team of poor roamers. Walking around without a goal in mind is fine in certain playlists, but if you want to improve, you have to think about where you are at certain points of the match and adjust. We know setup and we know some big roles. All that's left is some more specific types of operators we'll need. Wall denial are first on the chopping board. Your goal is to stop any important walls from being opened. Sounds very simple, because it is. At lower levels, you can simply set and forget whatever gadget on the wall, and then go do whatever. Wall denial is not always needed, however. There isn't always a wall that will win or lose the round. These important walls usually face the outside, as attackers can be outside, but defenders get their exact coordinates shown at all times when outside. This makes it a harder spot for defense if it's opened. Inside walls matter less, as defense can deny that wall from both sides. If you're new and interested, Cade and Bandit should be your go-tos. Cade can shock everything, including hatches, making him extremely versatile. Bandit can't get as much, but can bandit trick to stop anything from getting through. Cade tricking is possible, but you're gambling on the enemy Thatcher not knowing what he's doing. Bandit has a higher skill ceiling, but it's pretty hard to mess up Cade. Intel ops like Valkyrie or Echo rely more on giving information to the team. Their cameras will be a major asset in reacting to enemy movements. Skill floors are pretty low for these guys, you just have to leave a camera somewhere useful. At higher levels, you'll have to hide them, but they aren't ever not useful. Intel denial are very similar. Mute, Mozzie, and Solus are designed to take out enemy drones. The enemy has no idea what they're up against, they can't react to your setup or play positions, making your job much easier. Utility burners like Jaeger, Wamai, and Aruni are next up to discuss. Utility burners are essentially designed to counter countering, if that makes any sense. Nizami and Cigar can hold it quite nicely, but that's not what we're focused on. The attacker response to this would be removing the utility in order to get Izami to either die or retreat. If we bring along a Wamai, for example, a grenade, Ash Charge, or even a Gon 6 will be sucked up by our burner instead. Maybe the enemy has more grenades or another charge, but the important thing to consider is that the obstacle stays for longer, and once it does fall, the enemy will have less curveballs to throw at you later. Area denial is pretty straightforward. They stop attackers from being in certain areas. Yes, you're always trying to stop people from being in sight anyway, so I'll reframe the example slightly. They buy time. If you're fighting for your life, a smoke canister deployed on a doorway can give an extra defense for 15 seconds. You can take a quick breather while the attacker either has to wait out the smoke, die walking through it, or sprint through, maiming themselves and giving yourself a brief moment to shoot without risk. It's worth pointing out that area denial becomes more and more useful as the match progresses. Remember earlier when I said the last 20 seconds was for desperation plays? If that doorway is impassable during that time, it's practically over for the attackers. Smoke is practically king of area denial, Tachanka exists, he's kinda bad, and there's Goyo for when you don't actually want to play area denial, you can set and forget. Trappers and Flex are last. Trappers trap stuff, as shocking as that may seem. The four main trappers, uses vary, as only 2 are lethal, while the other 2 are more for slowing people down and skewing gunfights. Of the lethal ones, Capcan is great for if you're getting really unlucky one day or are new. Place them on doors and kaboom. Thorn is more challenging, for best effect leave them somewhere where people are likely to idle or plant. If they stay too long, they explode. Frost and Legion give the player a choice. Focus the fellow with the gun or prevent yourself from being crippled. Flex are ops that don't fit into neat little categories like everyone else. A mirror window is pretty hard to categorize as it's closest to area denial, but you still can't keep your eyes off the room for a few seconds like you would with Smoke or Goyo. Vigil can remain unspotted by drones, but this only helps the team if the Vigil can actually manage to capitalize off it. That's the categories that all defenders fall into. I didn't list every op as there's 37 of them at the time of writing this video. We're already pressed for time, so I can't tell you what each and every one are, but you're a smart fella. I think that you can find out what they all do after seeing them in action a couple times. And just like that, the video is over. If you are interested, I also have an attack 101 for you to check out, as well as setup videos I mentioned earlier. I hope you enjoyed, maybe learned something. That's all for me. See ya.